And to our very left, there is our keynote speaker, Paul Mockapetris, who is chair of Nominum, but he was invited here because he actually invented what we are talking about today, that is the domain name system. You have the more detailed bios, they were all distributed, so I think we can be short on that, and let's get started without further ado. Please, Paul.
Sure, thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to briefly touch on some of the issues that I found interesting, and I hope that you can too. I think the thing I want to, we were talking a little bit about the 25th anniversary, and if we go back to 1983, what was happening then was, if this was a TV show, I'd say previously on the internet, the scientists had been spending a couple of years in anticipation of replacing the ARPANET with the internet. And we all know that you can't throw big switches and have everything switch over overnight. But on January 1st of '83, it did indeed happen. And we sort of switched over to internet technology without having the ARPANET, NCP, and all of that other curious stuff as a safety net. So part of what happened was everything was up for grabs in the protocol stack, by which, for example, there was this novel idea that maybe mail should be its own protocol and not part of the file transfer protocol, which had previously been. Mail wasn't that important, so, there was, but anyway, it got separated out. People rethought the transport protocols. There were many, many things to rethink because everybody was revisiting everything. So, important folks got to think about the important issues, what was seen as the important issues. And in some cases, they were right. Routing still with us is a problem, important issue, and so forth. One of my favorites was that we spent an inordinate amount of time talking about how to do fixed length records over TCP. Particularly if there was 80 of them. We don't need to go into that. The design of the directory, which is a problem that's only, I think, within the last 5 years disappeared. We all know that the DNS is not a directory and that we need a directory in the internet, right? Until we finally got Google and those things. And so we kind of stopped worrying about it. People always say, how did you get the job of designing the DNS? It wasn't seen as an important thing. So, okay, Paul, here's a nice little problem off in the corner. Just host name to address, mind you. Don't do anything else. Yes, Daddy. Just give me the keys to the car. And also then, a lot of things seemed very simple. We didn't need to manage and allocate names because, you could write them all on a 3x5 or maybe 5x7 card to allow for growth. So, what was the intent of DNS protocol design? I say intent very carefully because nobody can argue with me when I phrase it that way as opposed to what's written down that I may have forgotten or what other people thought. One of the things was to try and cram as many features as possible into it, but everybody was saying it was too heavyweight. Nowadays, I always say, why didn't you have security in there? Why didn't you have, just a whole rash of things. At the time, people thought it was much too complicated and wanted to chop stuff away. So it was really to get as much as possible in a very small package and still have it sort of lift off at the end of the runway. People always say, well, there's nothing new there. And I sort of agree with that. I stole the name domain names from somebody else. Somebody else invented it. I didn't invent the name. In fact, Jon said, well, why don't you try and take these 5 different proposals for a naming scheme and come up with a compromise. And I did. The easiest way was to ignore what was in them and just, and the individual authors all said, well, you didn't take any of my stuff. And I said, well, that's big of you to admit it and not get upset. It worked for all of them. It was great. At any rate, the basic ideas, I think, were simple wins, reliable through replication. It had to be inherently fast, and we wanted to distribute authority and control because we were afraid that the SRI NIC would gum up progress of changing things. And it's sort of ludicrous today to think about SRI NIC as the ruling body that would gum things up. But, oh well. So what happened? I think a lot of what's happened since then has been a bunch of organic growth. I don't want to bore you with a lot of history. New applications. I think we've seen new applications at the start. And we're seeing them today. And then there's sort of the new dimensions of DNS, management, commerce, political, you could add others, that certainly weren't there in the old days. And we have a lot of experts for all of those dimensions, so I'm not going to talk about them. I think what we have seen is DNS use grows due to two things. We add new applications. So the first new application was MX, or mail routing, in the DNS, instead of just that name to address stuff. It's kind of amusing to me that that was the first application that wasn't designed sort of by myself. It was done by Craig Partridge. And these days we have people adding new applications to stop mail from being rowdy. In other words, anti-spam, right? So we use DNS to send more mail, and we use DNS to receive less, I guess, or there's a couple of different uses. Windows Active Directory relies upon it to start up, and there's a lot of these other applications, and they all sort of typically will grow a little bit. There's a bunch of applications not shown here that actually were defined and then failed. I think one of the characteristics of things that were defined and then failed were people said, I have this information and I could organize it and put it into the DNS, and and that way we could organize the information. And then the key question to ask them is, well, who would use it and why? Okay, well, people put MX records in because otherwise they don't get their mail. Okay, we understand that. Address records, or else their website doesn't work. All right, but there's been a bunch of other things like list which ports you listen to. Okay, it was proposed and defined and so forth. And the other thing is some of these successes actually weren't the first time somebody tried something. The MX record, for example, was version 3 of mail routing in the DNS. There are sort of 2 other versions that were tried and failed, which I think is something that people kind of lose track of. I think one of the characteristics of the earlier time was we tried things, and if it didn't work, we fixed them. There's kind of this rapid evolution as opposed to a decade-long design to come up with a perfect design, and then we'll try it and see if it, well, we know it must be perfect. We spent a decade on it. So let's talk about organic growth. Nominum basically does DNS servers for broadband carriers, so I can't tell you too much about what happens in small cases. But one of the things we see is rapid, if uneven, growth. A leading British telecom, that's lowercase b, I guess I'm not allowed to say the uppercase b, they said that they got queries doubling over the period of a year and then increased in 3 months. Other places have seen different growths at different rates. Some of it reflects DNS uptake, some of it reflects new users, new applications, whatever. It's growing at different rates in different places. Some of it is a virus. This is one of my favorite graphs. This represents query load in, I think this comes from Cable Deutschland, but there's a virus out there that just would wake up, do some business, and then go to sleep in a single machine. So the ISP was seeing this kind of pattern from a standpoint of DNS load, where the virus would wake up. The big, I think it's blue at the bottom, represents the different colors are different types. Address is the blue. So this virus would just wake up and generate a bunch of DNS stuff and then go to sleep for an equal period of time. We're not quite sure why. But needless to say, this kind of played havoc with excess capacity. A different ISP saw the same pattern, and they were scheduling their reload of zone files to be in the nooks rather than at the peaks, which I thought was kind of an interesting exercise. But these kinds of traffic patterns get seen out there. And again, this was one machine worth of damage. In Germany, we saw a big spike in usage that was based upon some application where you could send out a Christmas card and it would wait until the last business day to send it out, so that on the 22nd of December, there was a big spike in DNS usage because of this Christmas card and all these cross links and so forth it had. You can predict when Christmas is going to come, so I suppose you can plan for this. But another example of where you see spikes in DNS use was the Asian earthquake, where a bunch, I guess, of fiber optic cables got cut, and people kind of flailed around trying to get DNS access until finally some more servers were stood up and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of load, and it comes somewhat unpredictably. I think one of the big things that we're seeing these days is old-style web pages. I picked the New York Times, generated a reasonable number of DNS lookups, Whereas the things that are in MySpace oftentimes are done sort of at the exact opposite of the way web designers say you should do it. Clean, small number of things, right? It's like 1,000 little particles that each get sucked up from a different part of the world. So we tend to see a lot of growth. There's a lot of people that call us up and say, we've got the MySpace disease, can you give us 2 more software licenses? It's, you know, it's people are using the internet to do a lot more of this social networking and tying together a lot of sort of smaller particles of information, which is not a scientific way to describe it, but sort of carries the message. They asked me to tell you a couple of Jon Postel stories, so I will. One of my favorite ones was we were sitting, ISI sits on a street that's at the boundary between, it's in Los Angeles County and it's at the boundary of LA City, which is a different governmental organization. And when we got a phone call from somebody at the mayor's office for Los Angeles saying, we need la.gov, how do we get it? And John said, well, no, actually you should be registering la.ca.us because that was Los Angeles under California under US. And John liked to categorize things very nicely. And they said, too complicated, we want la.gov. And we said, well, you know, and John, I was just standing aside because I didn't like to be in these discussions. So that went on for a while, and then finally, there's rumors that our water and sewer are going to be turned off if we don't give Los Angeles la.gov. I actually, at that point, decided that I would do an experiment, which was to look up la.gov, and it turned out the Department of Water and Power had already registered it. So we kind of got out of that argument about whether or not we could tell the city of Los Angeles where they could register by saying, you already have it, what do you want? No, they have it. Well, look, it's just not our problem right anymore. I then subsequently wandered off to ARPA, and one of the things I did at ARPA was there was a top-level domain for NATO. A lot of people don't know that. But I sort of persuaded NATO to give it up because I didn't necessarily want to give a top-level domain to the Warsaw Pact as well, and you know, all these other kinds of organizations. But then one day I got a request saying, we're having a problem registering a domain. Can you talk to that guy out in ISI? I said, what is it? And they said, well, we want to register whitehouse.gov. So, you know, I'm working at ARPA, and ISI is ARPA funded, the US government. You know, John, there's a registration that doesn't fit the model. Can we please maybe overlook just this one? Well, who is it? John, just please don't argue with this one. Anyway, so whitehouse.gov got registered. But I think, you know, one of the things was that having a certain amount of pragmatism as well as spending a lot of work to try and organize things characterized John's contribution. And these were just sort of 2 of the casual examples that I have. What seems important now? We happened to give a domain seminar a couple of weeks ago, and what I did was I asked people for topics they wanted to talk about, and I vaguely grouped them into these 4 categories for sort of broadband users and, you know, what they might care about. And then when we actually did the seminar, the first thing I did was I said, well, what do you actually care about? So we did a poll, and this is sort of like a week old. So out of those, the things that are in italics were the things that we got out of about 200 odd people in the seminar about what they think of as being important. I think one of the interesting things here is that I think security tends to touch all of those, both anti-phishing, rebinding attacks, and also attacks on client machines. Turns out one of the more popular things to do these days in the way of, I guess, a DNS attack is to go break into somebody's Microsoft machine and just tell them, hey, use this bad guy open resolver who will point you at the right addresses for the right stuff, so that then if you go there and you say, well, I want to go to my stockbroker or my bank, it says, oh, okay, we'll send you to this web proxy, please give us the password right now. I don't know whether or not that's an attack on the DNS, but it's certainly an attack whereby you substitute in fake DNS names. It's a whole lot easier than all this stuff about cache poisoning, right? All you have to do is break into a Microsoft machine. How hard is that? So, you know, I think when people talk a little bit about how there's no future for DNSSEC and stuff, I think that what we're going to see is we're going to see more and more of those attacks that at all the different points in the food chain make that binding less trustworthy, and we ought to think about whether or not there's things we can do in an end-to-end way. What seems important to the author? Well, I think I just sort of hinted at it. You know, in 1983, we had the idea that what we really want to do is let everyone and everything own a name. If you want to do something, we'll give you a name to do it with. It may not be the, you know, beachfront real estate name that's just great and cool, but you can always get a name, and there's nothing different that you can do with one name from another. Marketing people would differ, of course. They'll say, I can make a brand out of that. But you know, basically the idea of any name was you could join the community and do what you want. You can publish your own data in there, and anybody can get it out. I think in 2008, you know, what's happening is there's a lot of movements to take names away from undesirables. And who's undesirable varies a lot. I think there's also the data from the source to the destination gets filtered multiple times. There's people that want to remove child porn, gambling, political dissent, on and on and on. Insert their own ads, all of that kind of stuff. I think one of the things that I think is a problem today is to figure out to what extent we want to and can guarantee some integrity between the source and the destination of the data. And yeah, I know all about DNSSEC, but at any rate, there's a bunch of these issues that protecting the XP registry is equally important to protecting the .com registry in order to get the job done. Of course, the DNS isn't alone from a standpoint of people trying to sort of pollute the. This is one of my favorite screenshots. You see, this is a Google web page, and this is what happens if you ask for google.com at Rogers, which is a Canadian cable company. They helpfully prepend this Rogers Yahoo high-speed internet thing up to the top of the Google page, all right, in order to go do this. This is just for random broadband customers. A friend of mine launched a company where he sort of created free Wi-Fi hotspots, and what he would do is in order to pay for the free Wi-Fi hotspots, he'd just helpfully replace the ads in as they went by in HTTP with his own, and then sell them. You know, you think about it, well, gee, you know, because I mean, he would go into a motel and say, well, you'll get more customers if you have free Wi-Fi. And they'll say, well, yeah, but I'll have to pay for it. And he'll say, well, no, you won't. You know, you just put in my box, which turns out to just be a standard Cisco Wi-Fi with slightly different code inside that just substitutes in ads. You know, I mean, we're going to have to deal with this. Is it okay to substitute ads if you're getting free access to the internet? Well, I don't know. Is it okay to substitute, you know, this kind of binding data as it goes by? Well, I don't know. You know, I think the information economy for these things is something that I think is the issue of the day, if I had to pick one. Facts to face, I don't think ICANN is too political. It just is politics. I had to make these slides up in advance, so I didn't know that Ted was going to say this, but I think it's true. I think another example in the technological world is we shouldn't worry about overloading the DNS. That seems to be one of the things that I hear a lot from the IETF community. I mean, those same guys would probably say, don't put too many files on your hard drive. We don't want to overload it, right? Or don't put too many different kinds of files. Or no, I don't want a bigger, you don't want a bigger hard drive, do you? Yeah. You know, I mean, it's to be used, and I think that if you don't put things in there just for arbitrary reasons, like those people I said that were organizing data about which ports are available that nobody wanted. But from a standpoint, if it will help us move forward, I think we should do it. So I think the future holds a continuing struggle between two factors. I remember the internet changes everything. That was a slogan about 1995, 2000. I was never able to trace it back to a single origin. But I mean, here, I think the important thing to remember, you know, Newton's third law, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. A lot of what we're seeing is the technology, and then the real world pushes back, and then there's excesses that provoke reforms, and I think the oscillation will continue. And I think it's a healthy thing, although it's a little bit painful now and then. So there's my remarks, and I guess we have more of a program going on now.
Thank you very much, Paul, for this